You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
Have you ooded lately? Do you ood often? Is oodering your thing? Or are you wondering what the ooder I'm talking about? I'm talking about the Boyd cycle, of course. And the Boyd cycle is something that is particularly important to understand if you understand how modern warfighters think about defeating the enemy. G'day, listeners, and welcome back to the Dead Prussian podcast. Thanks very much for your overwhelming response for our return to the season. It's been great to see the enthusiasm behind understanding Australian Valour Awards in our last episode. Thank you also for the iTunes reviews. We got 2 great reviews over in the US, actually, so thanks very much for the US and for both the people that did those reviews. Thank you for listening. Now, before I mention something about oodering, and we'll find out what oodering is, but to do that, we need to speak to an expert on the person who came up with the OODA loop. So, my guest today is USMC officer and pilot Ian Brown. He graduated from St. Anselm College in 2003 with a BA in History, commissioned in 2003 into Marine Corps shortly after. He has served multiple deployments to Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Pacific region, one of my favourite regions, as a helicopter pilot, and also did ground tour as a forward air controller with a Marine Infantry Battalion. In 2015, he earned a Master's in Military History from Norwich University. His thesis focused on John Boyd's ideas and their influence on Marine Corps manoeuvre warfare doctrine. This was the beginning of the work that has resulted in his book, A New Conception of War. He has also written articles on Boyd, manoeuvre, warfare, and future conflict trends for Marine Corps Gazette, War on the Rocks, good friends of ours, Australia Bridge, another great pal of ours, and other academic publications. And of course, all other academic publications are good friends of ours as well. He'll soon be moving to Quantico to work as operations officer for the Krulak Centre for Innovation and Creativity at Marine Corps University. And, like most of our guests, Ian's views are his alone. They do not represent the US Marine Corps or the US Department of Defense. Ian, thanks for coming on the show.
Mick, I appreciate you having me. Like I said, I've been a long time listener. I've enjoyed all the various guest viewpoints you've had, especially from the Marine Corps side. I know I'm not the first Marine, but I've loved listening to it, and I'm very grateful for the chance to finally participate in it.
Well, thanks for coming on the show. And as we all know, you can't actually just invite one Marine over for a party. You get a few. So after that first one, they've kept on rolling. Now, Ian, before we start discussing your research on John Boyd, and our listeners find out who John Boyd was, I'm keen to hear more about how you ended up writing a book for the Marine Corps University Press.
Well, I think I mentioned in the preface that it was kind of an accident. The book's an extension of work I did for my master's degree through Norwich University. I wrote my final thesis on John Boyd and how his ideas influenced the Marine Corps and how the Marine Corps came to adopt this thing called manoeuvre warfare as its capstone warfighting philosophy. And I certainly didn't go out looking to write a book. In the process of doing the research for my thesis, I spun off a few articles for the Marine Corps Gazette on a few areas where I didn't think I'd have time to sort of research it in my thesis itself, but I felt it was worth expanding on somewhere else. So I did that, finished my thesis, got my degree, and then based on my capstone advisor, he had a previous connection with Marine Corps University, especially the history division that's housed there. He had been a chair there, if I remember, for a couple of academic years. So he knew that the Marine Corps history division, they were revamping their semi-annual publication from kind of a short newsletter to try and turn it into a more academic type journal. And he recommended submitting the thesis as a potential article for the journal. So sounded like a great idea to me. I went ahead and sent it over to them, and not really having any high expectations. And they came back and said it was too long to be an article inside their journal. And I kind of thought, well, okay, so much for that. Go off to do something else. But they also came back and said if I was willing to expand on it in certain areas, that they'd be willing to take it as a monograph. And I was kind of shocked. I really didn't expect it to go in that direction. But I accepted with a little bit of trepidation, not really sure what I was getting into, because I've certainly never written or developed a book before. But I got assigned a very good editor who helped me kind of flesh the thing out into the product we have today, New Conceptual Work.
And you concentrate, as you mentioned, on John Boyd. This is who you focus on. Now, some of our listeners will know who John Boyd is. Some of our listeners will probably have a lot of misconceptions about John Boyd and his work and theories. Can you give our listeners a little bit of a background on who Boyd was?
Yeah, absolutely. And he is certainly he was a contentious figure in his own time. And since his passing in 1997, his ideas and his, sort of the value of his contribution has remained contentious. But I think in the book, if I remember, I called him sort of a son of the late Cold War. He was very much plugged into what was going on in the Cold War right through its ending. So he was born in the Great Depression. Father passed away at a young age, so he kind of had to step up in the family, and not an uncommon at all during the Great Depression. But the fact that he had to step up and kind of go out and do things to help out his family gave him a very independent streak, and it also gave him this. He enjoyed a sort of freedom to do what he wanted to, as long as he was coming back and producing for his family. So he liked doing his own thing from a very early age. Grew up, he joined, like every red-blooded American, he enlisted in the American military in World War II, but he only got in right at the very end. So he didn't actually see any combat duty in World War II. He was sent to Japan for occupation duty after the war, and he was I think he was assigned as a remote turret gunner technician on a bomber. So did some occupation duty, got out of the military, went to get his degree, and he joined ROTC to kind of get a little extra money at the time. But he also had a feeling that he kind of wanted to distinguish himself in the military. He didn't get the chance. And he had a feeling that there could always be another war around the corner. And it turned out 1950, he was right. So the Korean War broke out with his ROTC commission. He joined the Air Force as an officer and became trained as an F-86 Sabre fighter pilot. And this time he did get to Korea in time to be in an active combat zone. Although, kind of like World War II, he got there right at the end. So he was able to fly a few missions, and but he never quite got enough flight hours to go in and actually go shoot down, North Korean Soviet aircraft. But kind of some of the differences he saw between the poor performance of American aircraft and the Soviet aircraft stuck with him for a few reasons, which I'll try and touch on later. But anyway, gets out of the war. He's a good enough pilot that he goes back to the fighter weapons school for the Air Force, which is kind of the Air Force version of Top Gun. I'm not sure what the Australian equivalent of Top Gun is, but it's where you send your best fighter pilots. So yeah, he does that, and then when he gets there, he was not impressed by the curriculum that they had. He thought it was a lot of like just memorize the checklist and then go do it. So again, exercising his independent streak, he basically wrote his own tactical curriculum, and he got the school to buy onto it. And he wrote the first really codified book on fighter tactics, which captured a lot of the fundamentals and really haven't been improved on since then. So going on from that, he got into Air Force Institute of Technology program in the early 60s. And this is where the work he did there, he started developing what came to be called the energy maneuverability theory, which was a mathematical way that you could design a fighter aircraft to perform in certain parameters that you wanted to, but you could also use it to reverse engineer the performance of adversary fighter aircraft, which is really useful because nobody really had a good idea of what Soviet aircraft were capable of. This theory, it's still used to quantify aircraft performance today. Like in the back of the tactical manual for my helicopter, we have energy maneuverability diagrams, and so does every other aircraft, every tactical aircraft. So that got him a couple scientific awards, and from there he went to the Pentagon to work for Air Force Acquisitions. He got assigned to work on a kind of languishing Air Force fighter program that was it was overcost over time, and it was competing with a Navy fighter program that was doing a lot better. And the Air Force was concerned they were going to be told to eat the Navy's aircraft, which would have been terrible for the Air Force, right? So he applied his energy maneuverability theory to the prototype that they had, and after a lot of revisions, developed what became the F-15 Eagle aircraft. And after that, he was actually not really happy with the F-15 product, so he sort of started working on his own separate fighter program to have a fighter that met the pure energy characteristics he felt he wanted, and that would become the F-16 fighter aircraft, both of which we still have in service today. And so we're getting into early 70s now. I believe he's done this work on fighter aircraft. He'd always wanted to go though back to an active combat zone. He wanted to fly F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam. That didn't happen because he had to go fix the F-15 program, but he finally got a chance to go to Vietnam. He was commander of a base in Thailand where the U.S. was monitoring the Ho Chi Minh Trail with some of its sensors. Did that for about a year, came back to the States, and kept working on the F-16. But at this time, in the course of all of this, he'd sort of annoyed a lot of people with how he had a very sort of single-minded vision in going after what he felt was important in terms of designing, whether it was designing fighter aircraft, running a base, or what have you. And he finally got frustrated with the Air Force, with the military bureaucracy, and retired as a colonel in the mid-70s. This ironically gave him enough time to start thinking about several of the things he had sort of observed throughout his military career, and he wanted to start writing it down on paper. And this is where he sort of started his research into military history, different other scientific theories, which kind of all in the blender of his brain, he finally put together into this thing it came to be called maneuver warfare, which the Marine Corps, coming out of Vietnam at about the same time, was looking for a new way of going about fighting wars. And they found Boyd, and the two kind of started intertwining from there through the 1980s.
And so you concentrate on Boyd, and what an interesting career he's had throughout, the end of World War II, right up until pretty much the end of Vietnam. And you also concentrate on maneuver warfare, which is the theory you discussed at the end, and its influence on the Marine Corps. Now, can you give our listeners a little bit of background on what maneuver warfare actually is?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because there was a lot of disagreement at the time what it meant, and even today. But what it really comes down to, there's various definitions I could regurgitate if you really want. But what it came down to was throughout Boyd's study of history and what he had also seen, like I said, his observations between the performance of American and Soviet fighter aircraft. Later on, he had some more observations when he was doing the flight test for the F-16 and a competing airframe when the Air Force was trying to pick one. And also from some sort of sideways knowledge he got from old German Wehrmacht Air Force pilots who and generals as well, who he debriefed as part of the A-10 acquisitions program. He started to have this idea in his brain about a way of going after an adversary where you're not trying to just overwhelm them with brute force or have a one-for-one exchange of units and tanks and ships and planes, and then whoever's got the last tank and plane at the end of the day is the winner. He looked more at what affected an individual and then a group of individuals' ability to operate as a coherent and organic system that would, a system of different groups that are all cooperating with each other and working in harmony. And what he was going after with maneuver warfare was finding ways to break up all those linkages that allow those different groups of humans to operate harmoniously and effectively. And the idea was not to take all those different groups, those centers of gravity, and try and destroy them all entirely one by one. But if you could break up the connections between those centers of gravity and make them non-cooperative, make them a bunch of individual components, isolated, confused, flying off in their own directions, then you don't need to go and destroy everything and kill everybody, as long as you can render that system ineffective. And there were any number of definitions of this kind of going through the debate, but the Marine Corps finally settled on one that really summarized what he was talking about. And if it's all right with you, I'll quote the Marine Corps version right now. And it's a manoeuvre warfare. It's a warfighting philosophy that seeks to shatter the enemy's cohesion through a variety of rapid, focused, unexpected actions which create a turbulent and rapidly deteriorating situation with which he cannot cope. And so you see in that definition, it's a very human-focused definition that's focused on the adversary as a group of humans and how it operates together. And you're trying to not annihilate him physically, but you're trying to unhinge him at a mental and moral level. And that's sort of the nutshell version of what maneuver warfare was supposed to be about.
And so Boyd sort of starts to come into his own with these theories. I guess that anti-manoeuvrability thing is important to air jockeys, but for the rest of us, he started to come to his own with this theory. And how was it actually received at the time?
Well, he like I said, so he started kind of working on the first parts of this right about the time the Marine Corps was coming out of Vietnam. And I guess I should sort of back up a little bit. So all the like Army and Marine Corps, and Marine Corps was by no means unique in coming out of Vietnam feeling like it had failed. It hadn't done the job it was sent there to do. And so both services, there was a long period of introspection throughout the late 70s and into the 80s that led to a lot of reforms on both sides. But inside the Marine Corps in particular, Boyd really struck a note because as the Marines were coming out of Vietnam, feeling like they needed a better way to do things, because they some of the leaders, your infantry platoon commanders, battalion commanders who would later go on to have some key roles in the maneuver warfare discussion in the 80s, they thought they needed to do better. And as they were coming out of Vietnam, they were looking at the world around them to see, what is that next war going to look like, and how are we going to reorganize ourselves so that we can do better in that next war, and not have the helicopters leaving the embassy like we did in the last one. And as the Marines and the Army, they're both looking around at this new world out of Vietnam, and they're seeing a resurgent Soviet Union that is rearming, re-equipping. It's made significant advances in mechanization, precision weapons, and so coming out of sort of this lower intensity insurgent world, the Marine Corps is looking around and they're seeing a high tech, potentially high intensity, very violent field of conflict against either Soviet Union or Soviet equipped and trained allies that they're going to have to operate in. And their problem they faced is Marine Corps has always been kind of a middleweight force. They don't have lots of tanks. They don't have lots of mechanization. They have what they can put on a ship, and they have, once the ship gets there, whatever they've got is what they've got. But the nation still expects them to go and win in this environment. So if we can't put more tanks, and we can't get more people, and we can't get more technology, how do we still counter this massive, Soviet force going in as a smaller, more lightly armed middleweight force? And so a lot of Marines started looking at ways where they didn't rely so much on technology, but looking at ways of analyzing your enemy, analyzing those connections that made their soldiers effective, that allowed them to operate in these larger formations, and then how you go about breaking that system down, how you go about attacking their ability to make decisions, their ability to see information, their ability to see what you're doing, making yourself seem uncertain, making yourself seem larger than you really are. And so how do you do that? What does that look like? And it just so happened that Boyd was looking at these same questions sort of on his own, sort of more out of just because he wanted, it was an intellectual exercise for him. Nobody ever asked him to do it. He just thought it was interesting and he did it. So he's working on this. The Marines are actively looking for a new idea on how to fight on this new battlefield. And the two found each other because Boyd started putting these ideas into presentations that he would give to anybody who would listen. And he did a few, but the key one was called Patterns of Conflict, which I sort of focus on in my book. Yeah. And this was a sort of a sweep of military history, and then at the end, pulling out various threads that he found common across successful commanders in military history that did not rely on overwhelming mass or attrition, but relied on unhinging their adversaries on a mental and moral level. So he started talking this. He started briefing it to first just individual interested Marine officers around the Pentagon. He got a couple of commandants, but then as more people became interested, he started getting invited to the Marine Corps schools in Quantico. So he started presenting his ideas to the captains and majors who are going through school there. And some of these captains and majors, they really latched onto it. Yeah. And started writing about it and discussing it in the open themselves, especially in the pages of the Marine Corps Gazette, which kind of served as the unofficial discussion, before the internet. That's where you talked about, ideas in the Marine Corps. And so he gained enough traction, and he gained the interest of enough key people in the Marine Corps that a lot of Marines found that this was going to be the way they were going to operate. This is what was going to let them win on that huge, high-tech, high-intensity, violent battlefield where they did not have the advantage of numbers. And he got enough attention by the end. 1989, Commandant of the Marine Corps, Al Gray, at the time, he'd been a maneuver believer all through the 1980s, and he said, "This is what we're going to do." And so he told a Marine Corps captain to write the manual summarizing the ideas of maneuver warfare, put his signature on it, and that's how Boyd got into the Marine Corps.
And he hasn't left, has he?
Officially, no, he hasn't. The Marine Corps doctrinal publication 1 is called Warfighting, is still our official capstone doctrine. It was a slight update from the original manual, which was called Fleet Marine Force Manual 1 in 1989. But the same captain who wrote the first manual updated the second one, and Boyd actually had more influence on the more recent one than he did on the first one. So his ideas still very much underlie how we say we're going to operate as an organization on the battlefield.
And finally, your book is called A New Conception of War. Is that what Boyd gave the U.S. Marine Corps?
It was. Well, it was and it wasn't, and I'll explain a little bit. I pulled that actually. That's a quote from the oral history that he did with the Air Force, actually way back, really before he started influencing the Marine Corps, and it was when he was sort of first spitballing the ideas that would later come into his full Patterns of Conflict brief. But I think that what Boyd did was, and by his own admission, he wasn't inventing something completely new, but he was able to pull together the threads from a huge variety of different media, different areas that just outside of strictly history or military tactics. He was pulling in stuff from science, forerunners to what we would call quantum mechanics and chaos theory today, political philosophy. He was pulling all these things together, and he was synthesizing them and then presenting them together as a coherent thing in a way that hadn't been done before. So his new conception was that he was was tying together things that other people had seen kind of individually, but he was bringing them together in a way that had never been thought of before. And I think that's the new thing, that was the new vision that he gave to the audience as a wide, and to the Marine Corps in particular.
And focusing on his most famous, often simplified theory, the OODA loop, which is observation, orientation, decision, and action. One thing you note in your book is that this decision cycle developed from his experiences as a pilot, was often taken by acolytes and reduced. Because I'm looking at your diagrams in your book, and the OODA loop that I'm familiar with is a lot less complex than the full OODA loop that you've got in your book. Can you tell listeners a little bit about the OODA loop and I suppose the truncation of the theory?
Yeah. So the OODA loop, like you said, it's your observation, orientation, decision, action, and throughout patterns of conflict, he talks about it constantly, but he doesn't give you a diagram in that briefing. And he talked about it a little bit in some of his other briefings. And it was his way for helping you understand it. It was a distillation in a way of the very first written thing that he ever did, which was an essay called Destruction and Creation, which is it's completely theoretical, but it paints a mental framework of how a human makes decisions to ensure their own survival. And he talks about in that paper how you if you sort of close your mind off to new information, or you have an inward looking method of decision making, you potentially set yourself up to diverge your own perception of reality from the actual reality that's going on around you. So he talks about how, like, your decision making has to constantly be breaking down, building up that mental picture in your brain, absorbing new information, rearranging it in different ways to try and constantly be making decisions that help you survive. And the OODA loop is an extension of that, which he often applied in patterns of conflict. He applied it in a strictly military sense, talking about how if you find ways to break up or cloud or confuse that decision-making process for your adversary, you can gain an advantage over that adversary, because if you keep your OODA loop intact and constantly updated with fresh information, and you can break down your adversary's decision-making mental construct simultaneously, you can gain an advantage over him, because now he's reacting to things that are either false perception, or he's reacting to actions that don't matter anymore on the battlefield. And that's kind of what he was getting at with it. But because it's OODA kind of rolls off the tongue, it's a convenient shorthand.
Yeah.
And that became, for better or for worse, sort of like the shorthand version of what he believed maneuver warfare was. And his critics often criticized it for being an overly simplistic way of, a lot of them thought, hey, he's just applying like one-on-one fighter tactics to the massive complexity of, air, ground, naval warfare. You can't do that. But a lot of his supporters, they also kind of used it as a shorthand as well. And they often presented it in that more simplistic diagram that I had in the book, which is probably the one you were familiar with as well.
Yeah.
And so, people would look at it and they would think that that's what it is. And you could argue Boyd didn't really help himself, because he never really defined it until very near the end of his life. But then when he did do it, and that's why I wanted to get it into the book, was it's a much more, it's like he fought against closed decision-making cycles in talking about the OODA loop and how to gain advantage over your adversary. But then that simple 4-step cycle, it's exactly the closed cycle that he argued against. So I wanted to show the full thing, where you see how it's still a cycle, but it's got multiple feedback loops into itself. It's constantly sucking in new information.
Yeah.
And then when you look at the orientation phase, I feel like the orientation is probably the most misunderstood component of it. The orientation, phase, it's often described as, well, hey, I see something, and then I orient on it. What does orient mean? Well, I do some sort of mental process to analyze, and then I move on to my decision based on that. But when you look at the different subcomponents of orientation, there's a huge amount of stuff that you use to build orientation before you're ever at that moment on the battlefield where you're making a decision. So that's kind of what I wanted to touch on a little bit in the book. And as I've talked about the book more in various places, I feel like doing like a orientation could be its own book, honestly.
Yeah.
Because I think it's the key that holds the OODA loop together, and it's really that is the distillation of his the foundation of his decision-making framework. Right there is all those things that you bring with you to the fight that enable you to make those decisions more quickly, to outpace your adversary, to analyze your adversary and find ways to break up his decision-making cycle. You build all that before you ever show up to the fight.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that really sort of captures that and captures the deep richness and complexity that goes into a real maneuver warfare mindset is something General Mattis said. I don't remember exactly when, but I think it was the initial push into Iraq. Some reporter asked him, they were astounded at how quickly he was able to make a certain decision about a situation. And they said, well, you saw a situation and it took you 30 seconds and you made that decision. And he said, no, it took me 30 years to arrive at that decision. And his point is that was his orientation. He had spent 30 years building up the knowledge and experience and the problem solving skills inside his own mental orientation, so that when he was presented with that observation, his orientation, it was 30 years old. It wasn't 30 seconds old.
Yeah.
So I like that in sort of a nutshell right there is what the OODA loop means. It's not just something that happens right in front of you. It's something to be truly effective. You need to build towards it from sort of day one, so that you're ready to make that 30-second decision because you've got 30 years of experience and learning behind you.
Yeah, and for the listeners, make sure you get a look at this book, because the Orient section that Ian's talking about has things like cultural traditions, analysis, synthesis, previous experience, new information, genetic heritage, all working together in what looks like a massive Ouija board of military decision cycle making. But Ian, we have almost come to the end of the show. We have two more questions. One for our subscription listeners, those who support us through Patreon, our legends, and the other one, which is for everyone, including the cheapskates that don't support us. So right now we'll switch to our bonus question. And Ian, thank you very much for such a informative decision for the bonus question. Our Patreon legends will love that. But now it is time for the final question for the show. Actually, just the episode, because the show's still got a long road to go down, particularly with the
guests. I hope so.
We've got quite a few guests coming up in April, actually. So yeah, we're going to keep on going, because what we've found is that, if nothing else, the shows are very good for my self-confidence. Now, let's go to the final question, the question that relates to our mission on the show, and that is defining war in as many ways as possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself. Now, we do this because war is such an important conversation that needs to be had within societies when deciding on where they're going to go with it. I ask each guest to finish the sentence, war is, as part of this conversation. So, I ask you, Ian, please finish the sentence, war is.
So I've been thinking about this for a while, and I got one that I think is pretty Twitter ready, and but I'm also going to shamelessly steal from Boyd, because he went after this in his oral history as he was starting to think for himself about what war is. War is the drive for survival on our own terms, which I think fits pretty well in the Twitter limits.
That's good.
Yeah. And since we have extra characters in Twitter, I'll add a little bit of what he meant to explain that. Because what's that?
I said he's such a cheat, but yeah, I'll allow it.
Oh, you can cut it out to the first sentence. But he goes on to explain that you know war is in part of that drive for survival on our own terms, whether that's as a person or a group or a nation. We're always trying to improve our capacity for independent action. We want to do what we want to do, and we don't want people to stop us. But when we do that, it often brings us into clash with other groups or nations who want to do their own independent action. Um, our capacity for independence might deny somebody else's theirs, and this causes friction and conflict. And when the conflict gets violent enough, is when you get to war. And that's also paraphrasing him from this thing, but um, yeah, I think the drive for survival, the way we want to survive, is how he defined it.
Now that is a fantastic definition because it's completely fresh. Well, Boyd came up with it first, but it's fresh for the show. And really, if you didn't record it in a podcast, did it ever happen? Ian, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Mick, thank you so much. Like I said, I really appreciate the opportunity, and I hope your listeners enjoyed it too. And I hope they talk to the Marine Corps University Press about getting the book.
They certainly will, because I'm about to tell them to do exactly that. Now, listeners, this is a fantastic book. I was lucky enough to get a PDF copy and a hard copy of it. Why? Mainly because I wanted it to sit on my bookshelf so I look cool. And also, it is one of those books that you have to flick through. You have to flick back and forth, particularly when it comes to energy manoeuvrability theory. To be honest, I flicked pretty quickly past that part because no one makes me do algebra in my own time. But it is a fantastic and fascinating study of Boyd and his conception of war. And hey, if you are listening to this show, you're the sort of person who'll probably get a kick out of reading this book. Follow Ian on Twitter at Ian, that's IAN _TB03. And if you listen to the bio, you'll probably realize why 03 is important. Hit him up on Twitter as well. Hit Marine Corps University Press up. They are very generous with this book at the moment, which is great because the more copies of this book out there, the more people will be able to understand these theories. Also, the more you do that, the more you'll have a chance to subscribe to our Patreon program. They're not actually linked. That's a bit of a lie. But if you want to be a legend and if you want to listen to the bonus questions we provide for each of our guests going forward, you have to sign up, and you do that at Patreon. That is enough begging, selling from me. Get out there, get a copy of this book, read about Boyd, and I think you'll be surprised about what you know and what you thought you knew and what his theories actually were. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.